The hall pulsed with an electricity only moments of history can summon. The lights bore down like an interrogation lamp, and the silence was so sharp it felt like the nation itself was holding its breath. Every camera lens zoomed tighter, waiting for a spark, waiting for the kind of clash that would live beyond the stage. And then, with the confidence of someone who had never once been told no, Barron Trump leaned forward, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You," he said, eyes locked on his opponent, "are unfit." The words slammed into the room with the weight of a gavel. Gasps surged like a wave across the crowd. Oh, a collective shudder of disbelief. Commentators scrambled in their seats, pens hitting paper, whispers erupting into hurried notes. Did he really say that? Did he just go there? The insult hung in the air, unyielding, daring anyone to erase it. And yet, while others twitched with shock, Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. Her posture remained steady, her gaze calm, her silence louder than any outburst could ever be. She let the sting of the insult echo, refused to grant it power with a rushed reply. For a fleeting moment, the hall seemed suspended between arrogance and dignity, between the sneer of privilege and the quiet resolve of lived strength. What began as a debate had suddenly become something greater, a test of values, of identity, of what America chooses to honor. And as the cameras captured every second, no one knew that the most devastating moment was still to come. Because while Barron had his insult, Jasmine had something else entirely. But no one in that room could have predicted the recording she was about to play. The insult was more than a single word hurled across a stage. It was the collision of two very different Americas, one born into wealth and expectation, the other forged through grit, sacrifice, and the relentless demand to prove worth again and again. Barron's declaration of unfit was not an isolated attack. It was the echo of a system where privilege presumes authority, where the accident of birth is mistaken for destiny. In that instant, the nation wasn't just watching two figures spar. They were witnessing a deeper clash, generational entitlement against earned credibility. On one side stood a young man whose every advantage had been handed down like an heirloom. On the other, a woman who had fought tooth and nail to be taken seriously in rooms that were never designed for her voice. The contrast was brutal, undeniable, and it cut to the core of what Americans argue about every day: who deserves to lead and why. Layered beneath the spectacle was something more volatile. Race and gender pulsed through the moment, unspoken but unmistakable. For many, Barron's sneer carried the weight of centuries of dismissal, the familiar refrain that women, especially women of color, are not worthy of power. His words did not just challenge Crockett, they challenged every person who has ever had to fight twice as hard to be heard once. And yet, there she stood, steady, silent, unbroken. In her composure, supporters saw not just a politician, but a mirror of their own struggles. The immigrant who worked harder, the daughter overlooked, the worker dismissed until their excellence made them undeniable. Crockett's presence on that stage was itself a rebuke to arrogance, proof that credibility cannot be inherited, it must be earned. This wasn't just an insult, it was a test of dignity versus derision, of truth versus swagger, of whether America still believed in the promise to, had anyone from anywhere could rise. The air grew heavier, anticipation thickening, because everyone sensed what was coming next would not just answer Barron's charge, it would define the night itself, and the stakes were about to skyrocket. Barron Trump had never known a world without cameras. From his earliest steps, he was raised not in the shadows of anonymity, but in the blinding glare of dynasty. To the nation, he was the child in the background of gilded stages, the symbol of a family name synonymous with wealth, power, and controversy. To him, that spotlight was not a burden but a birthright, and it forged a confidence so absolute that it often crossed into arrogance. Where others learned humility through hardship, Barron learned dominance through inheritance. Growing up in the Trump orbit meant growing up shielded. Mistakes were softened by influence, failures disguised as strategy, arrogance applauded as strength. His every room was filled with deference, his every opinion amplified by proximity to power. Over time, he internalized the lesson that respect was not earned but owed, that leadership was not service but control. And as he stepped into the political arena, that belief became his armor. There were glimpses, even before this debate, of the disdain simmering beneath his polished image. Offhand remarks about rivals that dripped with contempt. Dismissive shrugs toward communities he never had to understand. Moments where his mask slipped and revealed not just confidence but a sneer, the kind of superiority born not from achievement but from insulation. For his supporters, these flashes of arrogance felt like bravado. For his critics, they were proof of a man out of touch with the very people he claimed to represent. Barron cultivated an image of certainty. He walked with the swagger of someone who had never been truly challenged, who believed that intimidation was the same as leadership. His presence in the debate hall was less about ideas than about posture. Chin high, smirk at the ready, words sharpened not by substance but by entitlement. It was this posture that led him to dismiss Jasmine Crockett with a single word, as though labeling her unfit could erase years of her struggle in service. But arrogance is a double-edged sword. It creates the illusion of invincibility even as it blinds one to the strength gathering across the table. Barron mistook Crockett's silence for weakness, her composure for hesitation. He leaned deeper into his performance, confident that privilege alone would shield him from consequences. He believed dominance was destiny. He believed the spotlight would always tilt in his favor. What he could not see, what arrogance made him incapable of seeing, was that Crockett's quiet stillness was not retreat. It was preparation. She had endured louder storms than this, faced tougher rooms, survived sharper insults. And in the stillness of her response, something was building, something poised to shatter the illusion of Trumpian invulnerability with a single move. But as Barron leaned further into arrogance, Jasmine Crockett's quiet resolve was preparing for something extraordinary. Jasmine Crockett's story did not begin beneath the chandeliers of power, but in the quiet determination of a family that taught her resilience before she ever dreamed of politics. She came from places where opportunity wasn't handed out. It had to be wrestled from indifference, scraped together from long hours and small victories. In her youth, she was not surrounded by privilege but by the grit of people who knew the weight of sacrifice, who worked not for headlines but for survival. Those roots shaped her, forged a steel beneath her calm surface, and taught her to see dignity not as a luxury but as a necessity. Her early career was anything but easy. Law school debts loomed, doors closed faster than they opened, and every step into the legal and political world carried the shadow of doubters. She learned quickly that she would not be given the benefit of the doubt, that she would be forced to prove her competence twice over for half the recognition. But rather than bend, she sharpened. Each rejection became fuel, each dismissal a reminder that her fight was not just her own. She was not climbing a ladder for herself alone, but carving out footholds for those who would come after her. Community advocacy became her calling card. She took on cases others avoided, spoke for those whose voices were drowned in bureaucracy, and showed up in neighborhoods where politicians rarely lingered. When local leaders wavered, she did not. Her consistency built trust, and trust grew into loyalty. People began to see her not as a distant representative, but as one of their own, someone who carried their frustrations into the halls of power and refused to let them be ignored. Her reputation followed her, sharp, fearless, unbending in the face of pressure. In hearings, she did not soften her words to placate the powerful. When confronted, she did not bow her head or smooth her tone. Her orage was not loud for its own sake. It was measured, intentional, and anchored in truth. Audiences who watched her saw themselves in her. The worker tired of being silenced, the immigrant tired of being dismissed, the woman tired of being told to wait her turn. This was the great divide between her and Barron Trump. Where his platform was inherited, hers was earned. Where his presence was granted by legacy, hers was demanded by perseverance. He walked on a stage because of a last name. She stood there because of a lifetime of proving her worth. Every glance, every word, every silence she carried in that debate hall was backed by a history of struggle that could not be mocked away. That contrast, though unspoken, was undeniable. As Barron smirked, Crockett's calm was the heavier force. She didn't need to posture. Her very existence in that moment was resistance. For her supporters, she was not just a candidate, but a symbol. That the system could no longer ignore resilience. That the overlooked could no longer be dismissed. And so when the insult came, unfit, she absorbed it without flinching, the way she had absorbed countless dismissals before. What Barron saw as weakness was, in truth, power. What he mistook as hesitation was, in fact, control, because Crockett had learned the difference between reacting and responding. And when her moment came, she didn't shout, she pressed play. The debate hall did not cool after the insult. It grew hotter, charged with a current that seemed to run straight through Barron Trump's smirk. Emboldened by the gasps his words had summoned, he leaned further into the mockery. His tone dripped with condescension, each phrase designed not to debate ideas, but to belittle the woman across from him. He chuckled under his breath, muttered jabs into the microphone, and punctuated them with looks toward the audience that said, "See how easy this is?" The crowd responded in fractured ripples. Some jeered, some cheered, and others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Commentators on the sidelines leaned closer, scribbling furiously, whispering predictions about whether Crockett could withstand the barrage. Every second stretched into spectacle, Barron reveling in the theater of dominance he thought he controlled. But Jasmine Crockett did not bite. She sat steady, eyes fixed, refusing to give his taunts the satisfaction of a flustered reply. Her silence began to work against him, each unanswered jab landing weaker than the last. The audience, at first entertained by his bravado, started to sense something different, a tension tightening, an anticipation building. It was as if the silence itself had become a force, pressing down on the room heavier than his insults. Barron, mistaking her composure for hesitation, doubled down again, his laughter louder, his attacks sharper. But the hall no longer roared with him. It held its breath with her. Everyone could feel it. Something was coming. A shift, a reveal, a moment that would flip the night upside down. Then, with the press of a button, the room froze. The silence was shattered not by words, but by a sound, tinny at first, then unmistakable as it poured through the speakers of the debate hall. Jasmine Crockett had pressed play. A recording filled the air, carrying a voice the audience knew all too well. Barron Trump's. It wasn't the polished voice of a candidate rehearsing talking points. It was raw, unguarded, and dripping with contempt. On the recording, he mocked the very voters he claimed to champion, sneering about how they'll believe anything if you just say it with confidence. Laughter followed on the tape, his own, self-satisfied and careless. Gasps rippled instantly across the crowd. The cameras swiveled in a frenzy, zooming in to capture every twitch of his face. Commentators went still, pens hanging mid-air, the script of the night rewritten in seconds. The audience, stunned into silence, leaned forward as though trying to absorb every syllable of the revelation. It was not just hypocrisy exposed, it was disdain laid bare. Barron's smirk faltered. His eyes darted, searching for an exit that did not exist. The same arrogance that had animated his earlier taunts now betrayed him, collapsing under the weight of his own words. He shifted in his seat, tugged at his jacket, forced a smile that landed more as a grimace. For the first time that evening, he looked small, cornered by a truth he could not laugh away. And Crockett? She remained still, unshaken, letting the recording play in its entirety. She did not rush to fill the silence. She allowed his voice to condemn itself. When the last note of laughter faded, she leaned into her microphone with the calm of someone who had been here before, someone who understood the power of patience. "You call me unfit," she said evenly, her voice carrying through the hall with quiet authority. "But fitness isn't measured in arrogance. It's measured in respect for the people you claim to serve. And respect," she paused, eyes locked on him as the room held its breath, "is something you cannot fake on tape." The crowd erupted, cheers, applause, shouts that rolled like thunder. It wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a dismantling. Crockett had not raised her voice, yet she had silenced his. She had taken the insult meant to define her and turned it into the proof of his own undoing. Barron sat rigid, his earlier confidence fractured, his practiced swagger crumbling under the weight of a truth he could not spin. The debate had tilted, the room had chosen its hero, and the villain had been stripped of his armor in the most public way possible. But the real earthquake wasn't in that room. It was about to erupt online. The moment the recording ended, the debate hall felt like the epicenter of a political earthquake, but its shockwaves did not stop there. Within minutes, clips of Barron's own words were flooding every corner of the internet. On TikTok, the video looped endlessly, paired with captions like, "He said what?" and "Arrogance caught on tape." Memes exploded across Twitter, with side-by-side images of Barron's smirk before the recording and his pale silence after. Hashtags surged to the top of trending lists. Cable news anchors scrambled to keep up. The clip replayed in split screens across networks, the audio punctuated by stunned commentary. One anchor called it the defining moment of a generation's politics. Another declared, "We may have just witnessed the instant Jasmine Crockett became a household name." Analysts debated what the fallout would mean, but their tones carried the same undercurrent. Something had shifted. For commentators and cultural critics, the symbolism was impossible to ignore. This was not just a clash of two individuals, it was the embodiment of a generational and cultural turning point. On one side, inherited entitlement, born into wealth and insulated from consequence. On the other, resilience forged through struggle, sharpened by experience, validated by service. The juxtaposition could not have been clearer, nor the outcome more resonant. Audiences across the country felt the moment as personal vindication. Immigrant families saw in Crockett's calm resolve the dignity they had carried into their own battles for respect. Young activists clipped her line about respect and turned it into rallying cries. Parents shared the clip with children, calling it proof that arrogance can be humbled and truth can still prevail. Unity swelled, not in the sterile language of politics, but in the emotional heartbeat of validation and pride. For once, the story wasn't about who shouted the loudest, but about who carried themselves with dignity when it mattered most. Yet beyond the trending hashtags, a deeper lesson was sinking in. The moment the recording ended, the debate hall felt like the epicenter of a political earthquake, but its shockwaves did not stop there. Within minutes, clips of Barron's own words were flooding every corner of the internet. On TikTok, the video looped endlessly, paired with captions like, "He said what?" and "Arrogance caught on tape." Memes exploded across Twitter, with side-by-side images of Barron's smirk before the recording and his pale silence after. Hashtags surged to the top of trending lists. Cable news anchors scrambled to keep up. The clip replayed in split screens across networks, the audio punctuated by stunned commentary. One anchor called it the defining moment of a generation's politics. Another declared, "We may have just witnessed the instant Jasmine Crockett became a household name." Analysts debated what the fallout would mean, but their tones carried the same undercurrent. Something had shifted. For commentators and cultural critics, the symbolism was impossible to ignore. This was not just a clash of two individuals, it was the embodiment of a generational and cultural turning point. On one side, inherited entitlement, born into wealth and insulated from consequence. On the other, resilience forged through struggle, sharpened by experience, validated by service. The juxtaposition could not have been clearer, nor the outcome more resonant. Audiences across the country felt the moment as personal vindication. Immigrant families saw in Crockett's calm resolve the dignity they had carried into their own battles for respect. Young activists clipped her line about respect and turned it into rallying cries. Parents shared the clip with children, calling it proof that arrogance can be humbled and truth can still prevail. Unity swelled, not in the sterile language of politics, but in the emotional heartbeat of validation and pride. For once, the story wasn't about who shouted the loudest, but about who carried themselves with dignity when it mattered most. Yet beyond the trending hashtags, a deeper lesson was sinking in. Barron Trump may have thought he delivered the final word when he spat out that single, cutting judgment. Unfit. But history won't remember his insult. It will remember Jasmine Crockett's response. With the press of a button and the strength of her composure, she transformed humiliation into empowerment. What was meant as a takedown became a turning point, a reminder that dignity can outshine even the brightest spotlight of arrogance. This wasn't just a debate exchange. It was a mirror held up to America, asking us what kind of leadership we want: privilege without purpose, or resilience shaped by lived truth. Crockett's calm defiance showed that real power doesn't come from inheritance or bluster. It comes from integrity, from the courage to stand tall even when mocked, even when underestimated. And now, the question passes to you. If you believe truth speaks louder than arrogance, if you believe leadership must be earned, not gifted, then don't let this story fade with the news cycle. Subscribe, share, and join us. Because moments like this remind us that justice isn't just an idea. It's alive, it's resilient, and it deserves to be told again and again.